Hi, welcome to this series of interviews that we run in parallel to the preparatory Blockchaingers Hackathon event that we call the Deep Dive on Global Digital Identity. My name is Rick van der Klei and I'm sitting here with Vinay Gupta. Vinay, welcome. One of the founders of Ethereum, can I say so?
Well, I came in a little after the founding. I joined about a year into the project, but I led the project management for the release processes and did a lot of the early communications work.
Yeah, and your own background is in computer science?
Yes, I started out in computer science in the early 1990s, and I spent the 90s basically as a graphics programmer working on things like flight simulators and games, and then I moved on to the web in the late 90s, and then after 9/11, I got into energy policy and natural disasters.
Yeah, so all social challenges and ambitions
Yes.
to which blockchain bears a relevance?
So my fundamental work is about how we manage climate refugees. So I have an open source design for a sheltering system called the Hexier. And the Hexier is probably the cheapest way of turning industrial production into emergency housing. And it's certainly the only plan I've seen that has the potential for rehousing hundreds of millions of people, which is the kind of load that we expect later this century.
We hope so.
Well, if we don't build some kind of capacity to handle refugees in those numbers, we're going to have real problems. And I think we have to start planning now to build the capabilities that we'll need later.
Yeah, how do you get into such a topic?
So I joined Rocky Mountain Institute working on energy policy books in, I guess, 2001 or 2002, and I invented the Hexier while I was at Rocky Mountain Institute.
And now that you are in the blockchain sphere, you're definitely part of the ecosystem with your role in Ethereum, with your role in Hexier Capital.
Yes, most of what I'm working on these days is a company called Mattereum, and Ethereum basically handles property rights in the abstract. Mattereum handles property rights in the particular. So it basically gives you the ability to have things like electronic deeds for property that you can transfer on the blockchain, but the transfer of title will be recognized by a court. So it gives us the ability to make property, and it gives us the ability to handle disputes which arise in property rights.
So this is an example of the Internet of Agreements.
Yes, exactly. So it's core infrastructure to build the Internet of Agreements.
Okay, so the core infrastructure, that sounds like something central authorities used to do back in the days.
Well, so the way that we look at this is that the natural place to put the blockchain is beside things like the United Nations or the World Bank. These things are global infrastructure, and the global infrastructure is things like the International Telecommunications Union and its regulation of satellites. You know, you need some way of coordinating this global function, but what we
in order not to bump into one another. Or?
Yeah, basically, right. And there's all kinds of global coordination problems. So right now, the global coordination problems are largely solved by international agencies. And what we have is a way of scaling these global cooperation systems. So it's not just nation to nation or satellite company to satellite company, but it's individual to individual. So it's, imagine, for example, the United Nations. The United Nations is basically a trade organization for nation states, and it represents the interests of governments. With the blockchain, we've got the
or their societies.
No, not at all. It's really just a trade association for nation states. The myth is that the United Nations represents the individual, but it never has. It has no mandate to represent a single individual. There's no way that an individual can bring, for example, a court case at the United Nations. It's only there for state-to-state diplomacy. So if we wanted to build something that was sort of like the United Nations but was for individuals, you need the ability to scale this global coordination function to billions and billions and billions of actors rather than only 200 people sitting in a room. And this, I think, is the long-term potential of the blockchain, that it gives us the ability to do this global coordination work for everybody at the same time rather than only for nation states.
And in real time.
And in real time.
Is that different from central authorities granting these services?
Well, so central authorities are just a way of organizing complexity, right? If you think about, for example, the index in a database or the index in a library, that's a central authority. It tells you where everything is.
Yeah.
So in any
and a credible one.
and a credible one, right? So in any instance where you're going to have to organize tons of complicated stuff, you're going to wind up with indexes, and indexes only really work because they're centralized. A book has one index.
Yeah.
So I think that what we have is a situation in which we are going to require both centralized and decentralized systems working together. The centralized systems handle things like proofs of uniqueness and indexing. The decentralized systems handle enormous volumes of transactions, and they handle people's individual liberty and rights.
And proof of work rather than proof of uniqueness
Well, so
as a mechanism to validate.
Proof of work is a brutal tool, right? It's the worst possible way of organizing a blockchain.
Worst,
right? Because it was the first one that was discovered. And, it's a very, very crude brute force instrument. It's consuming an enormous amount of CO2. It's wasting hundreds of millions of tons of equipment. Really, it's a terrible way of doing things.
Right? Now what?
Well, somebody will find a better way of doing it. But we haven't found a better way of doing it yet, right? So proof of work is like democracy. It's the worst way of doing things apart from all the others.
Ah, yeah, Churchill.
Yeah.
So that's your British a part of your identity.
Kind of British, kind of American, kind of Indian. I'm sort of from everywhere now.
Yeah. Now that we are discussing identity, personal identity, what's the principle that would help putting identity on the blockchain?
So the problem with identity is that there's really no such thing, right? There is a name given to you by your parents, there's a number given to you by the state, and that usually is what's thought of as your identity. But that's not your identity, that's the state's identity, right? That's your parents' identity. It doesn't really become you. You could say that a record of your decisions and your actions is your identity, but in some way that's your history. What happens if you do 50 years in quantum physics and then you decide you want to retire and become a Tai Chi teacher? Your identity is completely disconnected. I used to know a man called Ian Morrison, and Ian was an underwater archaeologist that paid the bills writing children's
not the door singer.
No. So Ian Morrison was an underwater archaeologist who paid the bills writing children's books. So he had a bunch of academic qualifications and academic publications about, puttering around 50 meters underneath the water in Greece with a flashlight.
And entirely different publications next to that.
This always caused problems with librarians because they always assumed that it was two men who both had the name Ian Morrison. And they constantly had this problem. They had to unify the catalogue listing to show that it was one guy. And that happened like every 3 years. He'd have to go and get all of his publications put under the same name again. So in reality, identity is very squishy, right? Governments care about your identity because they want you to pay your taxes. And that's the only real reason they care who you are or that you exist, right? Also for voting. For individuals who...
And maybe as a beneficiary of their policies?
Yeah, sure, right? But again, this is about your entitlements. How much are you allowed to take out of the system? How much are you allowed to put in? It's an accounting thing. It's got nothing to do with who you are. So most of the time, I think all that we really want is to know that the accounts are being kept correctly. So it's about paying the bills and managing the invoices and making sure people aren't double dipping from your social security pools and all the rest of this kind of stuff. Almost none of it requires identity. We need to know that the same person is not in there twice. We don't need to know who they are. We need to know that all the taxes have been paid. We don't need to know who paid them. There's an enormous...
So we only need fragments of our identity to be put on a blockchain for transactions?
Even worse, there is no identity. The idea that there is an identity is why it's so hard to build identity systems. All that are accountability systems. We never really need identity because you can never represent identity.
So that's not even a pars pro toto
That's right.
approach.
We just want to be able to know that the system has the accounting done correctly. Right? So we keep using identity as a proxy for correctness in the same way that we keep using decentralization as a proxy for transparency. Right? The main benefit of the blockchain is not the decentralization, it's accountability and transparency. What you want from an
knowing what you need to know.
And what you want from an identity system is accountability and accuracy. You want to know that all the bills are paid and you want to know who paid them. Right? So most of the time, we do far better if we figure out how to solve the problem we actually have, which is how do we make sure that everybody has paid their fair share of the cost of running a welfare state or whatever it happens to be, rather than chasing the idea of identity. Because if you ask a philosopher or a mathematician or a psychologist what is identity, you get 3 completely different answers. So
At least, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So from my perspective, rather than trying to chase down this spook called identity, what we want is accountability. And at that point, if we get accountability that works, we don't have to worry about the philosophical imponderable of identity.
And what does it mean for your own initiatives?
So what we really focus on is counterparty risk in commercial law. If I am buying your car, how do I know for sure that you own the car and that you are the person that's entitled to sell the car? So I need to figure out, firstly, who owns the car. Then I need to figure out that you are that person or you're their representative. And then I need to figure out that if I give you the money, I actually get the car. And those are three very slightly different problems.
To seal the deal.
To seal the deal. And we just work at a very, very sort of methodical, calm level to just close up the weak links in the blockchain identity trade ecosystem so that when you actually buy the car actually gets transferred legally and you actually own it. Now, cars are super hard because they're registered property with governments, different countries have different rules, so we started with copyright. Right? Commercial assignment of copyright requires enough identity to sign a contract that assigns it as copyright for a licensing. And that's a very thin layer of identity, so we have a very simple solution. As you get into more complex objects and different kinds of identity are required, you build more identity as you need it. But rather than
a car deal would require a thicker layer of identity than a copyright.
And it's bolted to a much more structural layer, whereas copyright is a self-assigned thing. As soon as you write a work, you automatically own the copyright on it. So we don't need to go through a whole complex registration process for the copyright. And then if you want a license, it's very, very easy to do. It's a very lightweight legal construct. So, you know, it's a case of not trying to solve the problem top down and build the overarching global identity infrastructure. It's more a case of just picking the things that work now and then building them into commercial products. It's a very simple approach.
And how does blockchain benefit from this approach or the other way around?
Well, if you want to be able to have a smart contract that allows you to transfer assets, you need two things. You need a concrete definition of what the asset is which is being transferred, and you need a proof that a court will recognize that transfer as valid. Because if I buy your car on the blockchain and then the court refuses to recognize that that was a transaction, you still own your car and you also own my Bitcoin.
Yeah, so the question we have to solve in such a case in order to validate such a transaction is?
Well, this is simple, right? What you need is a private court. You need a court which says, we understand the blockchain and we'll make sure your transactions go through properly. And you might think that that's a difficult process, but it turns out that there are hundreds of commercial courts that hear specialized cases. So if you have a dispute in, for example, construction or in shipbuilding or in oil rig maintenance, all of those go to specialized commercial courts because the regular court systems don't want to be cluttered up with cases that have so much technical stuff they don't understand them. They don't want endless expert witnesses traipsing in and out of their courtrooms telling them stories. They want to work with the stuff they understand, and they want technical specialists to go and do the stuff they don't understand. So we already have systems with tons and tons and tons of independent courts, and all we do is set up essentially a blockchain court. And the blockchain court understands blockchains, handles disputes on the blockchain, and it just solves the problem.
How does a blockchain court look like?
It looks exactly like any other regular commercial court. It's a bunch of very experienced lawyers, 20, 30 years of experience managing technical disputes in other areas. They train themselves, or we train them in how the blockchain works, and then they manage the disputes on the blockchain just like they did in, for example, IT law 20 years ago.
And the blockchain itself provides ample room to have smart contracts being legally enforceable and what you need? So
in all probability, in most jurisdictions in the world, a smart contract is probably a contract, right? It certainly passes all the criteria to be a contract in many cases. If digital signatures are valid, it's very hard to argue that smart contracts aren't valid, and a smart contract could meet the necessary preconditions to be a contract, like there has to be a consideration. So in all probability, smart contracts are already legal contracts. The problem is that if you're trying to enforce them like a legal contract, you have to prove to the court that the smart contract is a contract. And that additional proof that you have to perform is expensive, difficult, and uncertain. Because if you explain it in just the wrong way, the judge in the court may be like, I really don't think that's a contract. And it turns out that the misunderstanding of the technology then invalidates your court case.
So there are courts in the world validated by states already who are leaping into the future in this respect.
Well, there are a couple
There
are a couple of jurisdictions which have said a smart contract is a contract, but in most of the world, you'd have to prove it in court. And you don't want the additional burden of having to prove that a smart contract is a contract before you can have a lawsuit. So what we do is a lot of work on paper contracts. The paper contract says this is a paper contract, we all understand that. It connects to a smart contract, and the smart contract then becomes enforceable by virtue of the enforceability of the paper contract. And that approach it's quite technologically conservative. This is not a kind of bleeding edge, we're going to change the world as fast as we can approach. It's
not as disruptive as you can imagine.
Well, it will be enormously impactful if it works, and it's very unlikely to fail because we're working very closely with the real world. So imagine if you're building a bridge into the future. The thing about a bridge is a bridge has two ends. So the end of the blockchain space, which is connected to the future, is 100 lanes wide and made entirely out of chrome and stainless steel. The end of the blockchain bridge, which is connected to the present, is a bunch of rope with some planks hanging off it. We're very poorly connected to the present, and we're amazingly deeply connected to the future. So we're working at the end of the bridge to the future, which is connected to the present, and that's the part that we're reinforcing so that you can begin to pass real load over the blockchain. This is houses, cars, truckloads of consumer goods, real-world financial instruments. We're building the bridge at the end which connects to the present. All the attention and energy is at the other end of the bridge, but you need both ends of the bridge to be complete before you can actually do transactions.
So that's why you're getting the traditional institutions on board for this purpose.
Because if you want to build a bridge between the present and the future, you need both ends.
Yeah, terrific. And as one of the founders of at least the ideas that govern Ethereum, and as one of the front runners in the Internet of Agreements, it's very nice to have had you here because you can be described in many ways that all reflect one part of your identity from my perspective.
Lots of different jobs over the years. Yeah. And it's something where if you're smart, you're old, and you do a bunch of risky things, it's amazing how much experience piles up after a couple of decades. I sort of look back, and this is probably career number 8 or 9, and it's amazing just how much experience you gather. I almost feel sorry for people that succeed in their 20s, because if you succeed in your 20s, you do the same thing in your 30s and your 40s. But if you spend a lot of time doing risky stuff and there's a lot of failure and a lot of chances to crash the car and start over, by the time you get to my age, you have this very large kind of synthetic intelligence where you've got so many different experiences. You can really begin to connect together things that most people can't see.
So that's a lesson for you, youngsters.
Yes, fail early, fail often, and then in your 40s, you get to take over the world.
Wow, and you're on your way doing that.
We'll give it a try.
Next step would be space?
Actually, yes. So we're doing a bunch of work right now to try and build a clear understanding about the reality that we could actually ICO Elon Musk's Mars mission. Because there's something like a $600 billion asset bubble in Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these associated things. And it seems to be that the natural destiny of that money is to finance the space mission. In the same way that Silicon Valley spends most of its profits building spaceships, I don't see why the blockchain world shouldn't follow the Silicon Valley example. And I think you could get some very interesting property rights generated from a Mars trip. It's not just that you could ICO land on Mars. You could do things like sell franchises for industrial infrastructure. You could sell potentially licenses to particular kinds of services. There are lots of ways that you could basically figure out how to produce a usable financial instrument out of the potential of a Mars mission. And if we could figure that out, maybe we could find Elon Musk 20% of the budget from the blockchain world. And wouldn't that be an amazing thing for us to do?
It sounds like you're still living up to the advice that you just gave the youngsters at your age.
I do not intend to settle down quite
yet. Terrific. Thanks, and please keep doing so. One question for you, as a seasoned entrepreneur in this field, for the hackathon participants. In early April, we'll have a Blockchaingers Hackathon with all kinds of enthusiastic, maybe risk-taking entrepreneurs and hackers, developers in Groningen, the northern part of the Netherlands. What would you hope they would get out of such an event?
Well, so hackathons are normally very hard to get things done at. Because you spend
That's one, get things done.
Well, because you spend all your time talking to people and setting up infrastructure. right? You get the virtual machines set up and everybody's got to get their Git accounts going and all the rest of this stuff. And you spend like half the day doing that. So the first piece of advice is get all of the development environments set up, get the virtual machines set up, get the repositories set up. So you hit the ground with all of the infrastructure set up and then you just pour the projects into it. Second thing is figure out as early as you can who you want to meet. Let's get the organizers to publish lists of who's coming.
It's the
set up some
ecosystem
calls,
that's present.
Try and get everybody connected to the people that they want to talk to on the day first, so that you don't have this 4-hour process of people wandering around in corridors trying to figure out who they want to work with. As far as possible, do all the things that you would normally spend the first half of the hackathon doing online a month before the hackathon starts. Registries, lists, all the virtual machines, all the environments, all the rest of these things, get all of that stuff set up and running, and then on the day, people can sit down and actually get some work done.
Terrific. So live on the edge during such a hackathon. Thank you very much for your advice.
Splendid.